Every single day, massive wars, political collapse, and environmental disasters are reshaping the world, yet most people barely hear about them. While social media focuses on trends, entertainment, and endless scrolling, entire countries are quietly falling deeper into chaos. Cities are being destroyed by war, governments are losing control, and millions of people are being forced to flee their homes. At the same time, forests continue disappearing, and even Earth's climate systems are beginning to change in dangerous ways. But despite how serious these events are, many of these stories vanish from the headlines almost instantly. The most frightening part is that some of the biggest crises on Earth continue growing quietly in the background while much of the world looks somewhere else. So today, we're going to explore some of the major global events happening right now that deserve far more attention. One of the world's worst humanitarian disasters is currently happening in Sudan. Since 2023, the country has been trapped in a brutal civil war between the Sudanese army and a powerful paramilitary group known as the RSF. What started as a political power struggle quickly turned into nationwide chaos. Cities became battlefields, buildings were destroyed, and hospitals began collapsing under the pressure of war. Food and medicine became extremely difficult to access, forcing millions of civilians to flee their homes in search of safety. Many families now survive without stable electricity, clean water, or medical care. Humanitarian aid struggles to reach dangerous areas, while online misinformation and fake footage continue spreading confusion across social media. Yet, despite the enormous scale of suffering, much of the crisis continues unfolding quietly, outside the attention of most of the world. The conflict in eastern Congo is another major crisis that receives surprisingly little global attention. The roots of this violence stretch back decades, especially to the aftermath of the 1994 Rwanda genocide, when armed groups fled across borders into Congo. Since then, the region has remained trapped in cycles of violence, rebel activity, and political instability. One of the most powerful groups today is the M23 rebel movement, which has been accused of receiving outside support while continuing attacks across eastern Congo. Entire communities have been forced to flee, and many civilians now live surrounded by fear and uncertainty. What makes this region especially important is that eastern Congo contains valuable minerals used in modern technology like smartphones, batteries, and electronics. In other words, global technology and local conflict are quietly connected. Yet, despite years of violence and humanitarian suffering, much of the crisis continues unfolding outside the attention of the wider world. Not every global crisis involves war or political collapse. Some of the most dangerous changes are happening inside Earth's climate system itself. Scientists have increasingly warned that a major Atlantic Ocean current system, known as the AMOC, is weakening. This system helps regulate temperatures and weather patterns across large parts of the world. If it weakens too much, researchers fear it could disrupt rainfall, agriculture, sea levels, and temperatures across multiple continents. Some regions could experience stronger storms and floods, while others may face extreme droughts and food shortages. What makes this especially concerning is the possibility of climate tipping points, where environmental change suddenly accelerates instead of happening gradually. And throughout history, climate instability has often contributed to migration, economic pressure, and political unrest. The frightening part is that many of these environmental changes continue developing quietly in the background long before most people fully notice them. Haiti has become another example of how quickly a country can fall into deeper instability when political systems begin collapsing. After years of unrest and the assassination of President Jovenel Moïse in 2021, armed gangs expanded their control across large parts of the capital. Streets became increasingly dangerous, prisons were attacked, and critical infrastructure like hospitals, ports, and transportation systems began struggling to function. For many civilians, daily life turned into a constant fight for safety, food, and medical care. Families now live surrounded by violence and uncertainty, while thousands continue fleeing dangerous neighborhoods. And despite how severe the situation has become, global attention repeatedly fades after only brief moments in the headlines. Haiti shows how fragile modern societies can become when governments lose control and public institutions begin breaking down. One of the quietest environmental crises happening today is the massive decline in insect populations across parts of Europe. Over several decades, researchers discovered dramatic drops in flying insect numbers, raising serious concerns about the future of entire ecosystems. At first, this may not sound important, but insects play a critical role in nature by pollinating plants, supporting food chains, and helping ecosystems remain balanced. Scientists believe intensive farming practices and widespread pesticide use are major causes behind the decline. And because this crisis happens slowly and quietly, many people barely notice it happening at all. But if insect populations continue collapsing, the effects could eventually spread far beyond nature itself, affecting agriculture, food systems, and the stability of ecosystems that humans also depend on. In 2021, Myanmar's military seized power in a coup, overthrowing the elected government and triggering massive protests across the country. But after violent crackdowns against civilians, many people decided to fight back. What followed was a nationwide civil war involving resistance groups, ethnic militias, and the military government itself. Entire villages have been destroyed by airstrikes and military operations, forcing millions of civilians to flee their homes. Families now live surrounded by fear, instability, and constant uncertainty as the conflict spreads across large parts of the country. And despite the scale of destruction and humanitarian suffering, much of the war continues unfolding outside the attention of the wider world. Myanmar has become another example of how quickly political instability can evolve into a long-term humanitarian disaster. Across parts of Europe and the Balkans, growing frustration over corruption, political instability, and government failures has triggered large protest movements in recent years. Many demonstrations have been led by students and younger generations who believe their futures are being damaged by weak institutions and corruption. In some countries, deadly accidents and infrastructure failures became powerful symbols of deeper public anger. As protests spread across borders, social media helped movements inspire each other almost instantly through shared slogans, videos, and online activism. In several places, governments are now facing increasing political pressure as public frustration continues growing. While these protests are very different from full-scale wars happening elsewhere, they still reveal how unstable and divided many societies around the world have become. While many people focus on famous rainforests like the Amazon, another massive ecosystem is quietly disappearing across southern Africa. The Miombo woodlands support huge amounts of wildlife, biodiversity, and millions of people who rely on these forests for survival. But deforestation, charcoal production, and uncontrolled fires continue destroying large parts of the ecosystem every year. As habitats disappear, wildlife populations decline and environmental damage spreads across the region. At the same time, human rights organizations continue raising concerns about the treatment of Uyghurs in China's Xinjiang region. Reports describe mass surveillance, detention centers, restrictions on religion, and forced assimilation policies targeting the Uyghur population. Because information coming out of the region remains heavily controlled, much of the situation stays difficult for the outside world to fully understand. Together, these stories reveal how some of the most important global crises often continue developing quietly outside mainstream attention.